just love the sounds they write in comic books. Thump, thump, thump. Crunch. Foom, foom, foom. Screonk. 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 Is that meant to be Godzilla's roar? They really should have put... That would have been much more realistic. Hey folks, welcome back to the Pterodome. So I'm going to talk about Godzilla King of the Monsters today. I finally managed to see this film after 5 years of waiting for the sequel to the Gareth Edwards Godzilla film from 2014. I've been itching to see it because I'd been hearing rumours for a long time that they were going to include lots of the Japanese characters like King Ghidorah, Mothra and Rodan, and lo and behold all those three were in it, and it was really exciting time for a Godzilla fan to see sort of a Western movie made on a Hollywood budget that was actually going to include these characters. I believe it was the first time that these sort of specific characters were going to appear in an American Godzilla movie, so the hype was up there. Just for some context, it's a sequel to Godzilla from 2014 directed by Gareth Edwards, but it's part of the Monster Universe which they're creating, which is, I believe, only 4 films long, which is, in my opinion, very good amount of films to do a sort of a cinematic universe of. I do like the Marvel movies, but at the same time there's like 25 of them, and it's like I don't think I'll ever really watch many of them again. Now they've ended it. But I like 4 movies. 4 movies is a good round number for me. But in chronological order in terms of the story, it goes Kong Skull Island, set during the Vietnam War, Godzilla from 2014, then Godzilla 2 King of the Monsters, which is what we'll be talking about today, and then Godzilla vs. Kong, which is out next year, which I can't wait for. So this is a sequel to Godzilla and follows on from the fallout of what happened in that story. Now, how can I describe this film? This film is big. Like the film is big. The creatures are big. The action's big. The music's big. Everything about this film is just big. That's the only way I can really describe it. Even the human story, which I'll really get into in a minute, that is big, and that might be a little bit too big. But it dawned on me before I went to go see this film that the Godzilla series is quite a funny series. Every single film out of the 30 plus movies that they've made at this point, I think it's like 35 now, it's all about how do the humans deal with these creatures that, they're just too big. So like if Godzilla was like this big, he'd still be dangerous because he'd have his atomic breath and his strength and all that sort of stuff and be indestructible, but he wouldn't necessarily be able to cause as much destruction at one time as he does when he's the size he is in the movies. So the whole film, I kind of had a smile on my face because the whole thing, right from the get-go, because the whole thing I was just thinking this is a film about people not knowing how to deal with these animals that they're just too big. They're just too big. But then, funny enough, the animals in the film, because they are meant to be like these massive kaijus, like all the action is very big. Like when their feet come down, it's like poof, and the whole ground ripples and there's dust and all this sort of stuff. Like everything they do is impactful because of their size. And I thought, all that aspect of the story, of the visuals and the sound, and that was 2 thumbs up. Like the monster action in this film, you can't fault it. It's exactly what you want from a Godzilla film of this caliber. That said, just going back now to the human aspect of it, I thought the human elements were actually a little bit too big. I thought the human story could have actually been subdued some to mainly just help with the flow of the film. I didn't mind the actors. I thought the actors all did a fantastic job with what they had, and I genuinely did kind of like the story as a whole. And it was crazy at times what you were watching the humans go through while you're watching this giant monster battle happen at the same time. Just for example, there's a scene where like they're in this giant like stealth bomber plane flying through the air, doing all these like dips and going up, and this plane is like the size of a skyscraper in itself, and they're all in there standing around the table and all strapped in chairs, like yelling about what to do. And while they're flying along, like they're chasing Rodan or they're watching Rodan fight King Ghidorah at the same time, and it's just like it's such an overload of stuff that I was taken aback by that. I didn't expect the human element to be so big, like the human action to be so big compared to the monster action that was already big, not only in scale but in scope and the way it was played out. But I thought that was maybe a little bit over the top. But then again, I was constantly reminding myself when I was watching it that you can't take it too seriously. Now, that's not to say you should leave your brain at the door. That's not what I'm saying. These films, a lot of films have visuals and sort of symbolic things happening in them that sort of have deep connections to narrative and stories that have been around for thousands of years. But every time something really, truly crazy happened on screen, especially involving the humans, that I thought maybe took me a little bit out of the film, I just cast my mind back to the Toho Godzilla films. Now, there is a reason I have the pile of the Heisei era Godzilla films here. This film, to me, felt like it was an American version of the Heisei era Godzilla films, especially something like what we've got here, like Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla 2, which I will go in a little bit more detail in a minute. There's a specific thing that happens in this film that they do in this new one that I want to just mention briefly in a second. But you watch the Heisei era of the Godzilla films from Toho, and you are watching basically what you see in King of the Monsters, just obviously done with more practical effects opposed to CGI. The craziness levels in those movies are just through the roof. And so every time I was watching this film and I was thinking, this is like almost so unrealistic, especially when you sort of compare it to Gareth Edwards' Godzilla. Not so much Kong Skull Island, that seems to be sort of just as crazy as this in parts, but Godzilla from 2014, I feel like Gareth Edwards was really trying to ground the world of these creatures. But I remember saying when I saw Godzilla 2014, they'll never bring in like Mecha Godzilla or Mecha King Ghidorah. Not anymore. Not after seeing Godzilla King of the Monsters. Now I'm like, yes, they can come in. Like they've completely opened the floodgates to everything. The craziness levels have just been ramped up to 11, and one part of me, a very small part of me, was kind of disappointed with that, just because I've seen it in the Heisei era Godzilla films. I've seen that craziness, and I kind of wanted it to keep that sort of style that was sort of grounded style that was with the Godzilla 2014 film. But then again, I let my hair down and I was just like, do you know what? Like, this is the Godzilla series. We're 35 films in, or whatever the number is now. And so how are they really doing any wrong at this point? Because there's so many films to choose from in the Godzilla library. If I want the serious, really truly terrifying Godzilla film, I'll watch the original 1954 one. If I want the sort of modern-esque equivalent to that, I'll watch the Godzilla 2014 one. So those films exist, but if I want the crazy Heisei era Godzilla films, I'll watch those. But then if I want to see what those would look like with the effects and the Hollywood budget and sort of the Western tone to it in a way, I'll watch Godzilla King of the Monsters. There's just more choice. But yeah, so that's my sort of takeaway from sort of the feeling of the movie. But there's other things that I really liked that I want to get onto before I just talk about a couple of little nitpicks that I have. The score, oh my word, the score was just phenomenal. Like the whole bringing the old theme tunes back for Mothra and Godzilla and all that, like it just sounded so good, and that, I give it 2 thumbs up. Yeah, it was a fantastic score. But there was an end credits song that was singing like "Go Go Godzilla" that I thought was a little bit tongue-in-cheek to begin with, and I left the screening feeling a little bit cringy, would I put it that way. I was like, oh man, why did they choose to put that song over the credits for this? Even though it was an over-the-top movie, they did kind of play it very seriously. I was like, it kind of made me, it reminded me of the end credits of Godzilla 1998. But then it was pointed out online on the internet, and that it was an old song from 1977 from the Blue Oyster Cult, which I have actually heard before. I just didn't know why it didn't click, and so upon reflection, I know I've only seen it once, and I will see the film again. So knowing this, I'll reevaluate that. Maybe it's just my cynical mind just being too negative, but I personally wouldn't have had that over the end credits until maybe sort of towards the end of the credits, just to be like an Easter egg for those people who stay during the credits, because you end the film on such a note of Godzilla is king of the monsters, and he's standing and he's roaring triumphantly in front of all the other kaijus, that I thought like you could have a bit more of an epic score to sort of hail the arrival of the king, as they sort of say. But yeah, no fault to the song. It is a classic song, and I do recognise that. Yeah, I would have left that out personally. But yeah, the rest of the score, all the music, fantastic. The acting, all great. I really liked all the characters in the film for the most part. That said, and going back to the human element being too big, I genuinely thought that the human characters could have been either cut down by numbers, because there's a lot of people in this movie, cut down a lot of the cast and focus it more, and also cut down the locations that they go to. You basically follow this family pretty much through two different locations, and without going into it, it's quite a complicated sort of situation, but my point I'm making is that like they have to meet up at some point, but then before they meet up, they have to go off to different locations, and it's just, you've already got all this giant monster action happening, and there's already a lot at stake, and it just felt like there was too much cream in the pudding. I don't even know if that's a saying, but that's what I'm going to say for it. There's too much jam in the donut in terms of the humans, and I feel like that just cutting that down a little bit, like I said, maybe cutting down the number of people in the film, or cutting down the locations, would have actually helped the flow of the film and made it more of a sort of a smoother ride, rather than we see the monsters and they're doing their thing, and then we cut back to this human thing and they're doing their action sequence and all this sort of stuff, and because it didn't really have a build up. It was action from the beginning of the movie to the end, pretty much. I think there was only like 15 minutes of calm at the beginning, but that's an actual nitpick, because like I said, you watch the Heisei era Godzilla films and they're basically the same, although they do temper the human story a little bit. There's not as many characters in there, but it's sort of like the same sort of thing is happening. There's a scene where Mothra, and I'll get more onto Mothra in a second, Mothra sacrifices herself to recharge Godzilla, and then Godzilla basically evolves into sort of this giant red molten fire god, basically, and he, like, wherever he steps, buildings are melting and stuff, and then he fires this giant red dome of energy out, which destroys everything. And when watching it, I was like, hang on a second, I've seen this before. And it was in Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2. There's a scene in this film where Rodan goes and sacrifices himself by lying on Godzilla, and he transfers his energy to Godzilla, and Godzilla wakes up and he has the red fire beam instead of the blue one, and the atomic breath, sorry, and that's how it plays out. The difference being, and this is why it's a nitpick in my mind, is they explicitly state in the new Godzilla film, and obviously in this one, that Rodan is a fire god. Like, he's he comes out of a volcano, and so it makes sense in this one that why Godzilla then suddenly gets like red fire powers from it. Whereas in this movie they did it with Mothra, and I kind of feel like that missed the point. Like, because Mothra, they say in this new movie that Rodan is the fire god, so I was like, oh, it should have been Rodan, even though it was a remake of that scene. it kind of was jarring to see Mothra give Godzilla those powers, because Mothra in the old films wasn't really about destruction, she was about protection. And so and I kind of feel a bit bad that I don't know if they're going to bring Mothra back, because there was only one lava in the movie and usually Mothra has two. But yeah, I think that it's kind of jarring to see Mothra die. I thought that that she was going to live, and it should have been Rodan that gives Godzilla the fire powers. And obviously Rodan is fighting with King Ghidorah, so it makes sense that for him to turn against King Ghidorah, that he would sacrifice himself to sort of redeem himself. That's what I got. I think that's what, if I remember correctly, that's what plays out in this film with Rodan. He's like sacrificing himself to sort of appease what he's done to Godzilla. But anyway, that was a tiny nitpick. I was like, it should have been Rodan. Another sort of thing that sort of was jarring to me, I don't really have any real issue with this, but I thought I'd just mention it anyway. I missed the twin fairies. So all in all, I really enjoyed Godzilla King of the Monsters, and I had a lot of fun with it. I can see why some people out there, namely critics, don't really want to get on board with this movie. I was on board with it mainly because I've seen all these old Godzilla films, and they are crazy, if not crazier than this movie. They're not as loud or as in your face as this movie. I mean, my word, this film's so action packed, and the fights are throwing down, and with the special effects, it just looks insane. And I believe it was possibly the loudest film I've ever seen at the cinema. But the old films are very much cut from that same cloth, as I mentioned. And so I was watching it going, I've seen a lot of this stuff before in the Japanese films, but it was interesting to see it done in this style. And I thought that was sort of worth the price of an admission ticket. But I did kind of miss the fact that from Godzilla 2014, the groundedness feel of that film, I did kind of miss that in this one. It had elements of that, but it quickly shed that off and then just went full blown crazy. But I did enjoy the film, and I feel like it's a kind of take it or leave it movie. You either really enjoy it or not. But that said, I do, and I will state this, because we have a very strange thing going on in the Godzilla fandom. We have two separate branches of the family tree coming out at the same time. You have Toho and the Japanese Godzilla films and what they're doing, and you have the American Godzilla Monsterverse, with Godzilla and Kong and all that. And I will say this, the American ones are tending to do what we've seen before from the Toho films of yesteryear, like the Heisei era films and even some of the 60s Godzilla films, that you see them sort of remaking that but on a Hollywood budget over stateside. And then in Japan, they seem to actually be pushing the character even further, and I think that might be because they've been making these films for 50 plus years or whatever it is now. And I really think that they have been experimenting, because, like I was saying at the beginning of this review, this new Godzilla film is all about things being big. They're too big. Like, what do you do with these creatures that are just this massive and can cause this much destruction? I mean, Rodan flies over a city at one point and it just blows the entire city away. And obviously that happens in the original Rodan, the old black and white one. But obviously with these modern effects and the way they show it, they present it in a more realistic fashion. But that said, like, they don't know what to do with these creatures because they're too big. Whereas in like Shin Godzilla, even though he is really big, the film kind of subverts that right at the end. Just before the end credits, it shows Godzilla breaking down into these smaller humanoid creatures. So it's not actually about how big he is in that version of the film. It's about like what's going on the inside genetically, and so I really think that they push the boundaries in terms of what they do with the characters. I mean, the anime trilogy. I did a review for the first part of that. I've yet to talk about the other two. I have seen them. Of the anime movies that Toho produced. I really enjoyed those. I'm probably in the minority there, but I really enjoyed those movies for what they what they did, completely bringing new stuff to the lore. And so like they have King Ghidorah in the last one of that movie, but King Ghidorah in that movie is literally a god. Like he comes out of this dimension, and it's like he's not just like a big monster from another planet. He's a literal god that Godzilla has to then beat, and they do different things with him than just having him a three-headed dragon. And so I like the sort of the differences. I like you've got the familiar with the American movies now, and you've got the new with the Toho movies. So you can pick and choose which one you want. And I think as fans of this franchise, we're very lucky to have that kind of thing going on. So yeah. Anyway, I do recommend Godzilla King of the Monsters. Go out and see it. Just be warned that it is loud, it is in your face, and it is action from start to finish. Just have fun with it. Like, let your hair down, and yeah, just have a good time. So there you go. 2 thumbs up from me, and I will get back now to reading about the Scree Onks.